so beautifully. If there are any kids, I don't know if there's any primary age kids here, then we've got our kids' life that happens upstairs that runs alongside this as well. Well, we're into the second half of this series now, and in the story that we're looking at today, we're looking at a few chapters, so it's a big chunk of story. And there's a fair bit of movement in it, so just warning you. Hopefully you can keep up with where it goes and I can explain it clearly enough that it makes sense. But what we're seeing is that there are two houses at war in this story. The house of Saul, who has been the king of Israel, and the house of David, who has been promised to be king one day, but has been pursued by Saul for the last 10 or 15 years of his existence. And Saul in the story has just died, and David has mourned his death. Saul's son Jonathan, who would have been heir, has also died, and David was close with him and mourned his death. They've died in battle. And at this point, it seems to David that the kingdom is being handed over to him. He's now, Saul's gone, he's going to be king of Israel. And what he starts by doing at this point is he inquires of God. And he says to God, is it the right time? Is it time for me to step into this leadership role that you've promised me, that you've made me for, you've been preparing me for? Is it now? And he hears from God to say, yes, it's time to go. You can go back into the land of Judah. It's safe for you to go there. And so he goes up, goes to a place called Hebron, and he takes with him his two wives, and they make their home in Hebron, and there David is crowned the king of Judah. So one of the tribes of Israel, he's crowned the king of Judah by his own people, in the anticipation that he will be the king of all of Israel very soon. And he sends messengers up to Saul's capital, Jabesh Gilead, and he says to them, I'm impressed by the way that you have mourned Saul's death. He was a great man. I had great respect for him. I honor him, and I appreciate the way that you've shown him honor in his death. Now I am here, and I've been crowned king of Judah. Will you come and join me and sit under my kingship? And he doesn't probably know what's going to happen, what they'll say. But what does happen is Abner, the leader of Saul's army, has a different plan. And he installs one other of Saul's sons named Ishbosheth as the king of Israel and tries to band together all the tribes of Israel, apart from Judah, to under Ishbosheth after Saul, so Saul's household can continue. And the story that we're looking at today is the rise of David to the throne after the death of Saul. I'm going to tell the story fairly quickly because there's a fair bit of movement in it, but I would encourage you to read these chapters on your own. It's 2 Samuel chapters 2 to 4, slowly, because there's a lot in it. And the thing that I want to point out and to help us to notice in these stories that we're looking at today is about David's leadership. When you look at his leadership, what is it about the way that David leads that enables him to be successful in uniting the kingdom under his rule? Because at the moment it's in shambles, and they're off fighting battles with the Philistines, and even internally it's not unified, and the whole nation comes unified under David. What is it about his leadership? David is a very strong personality. We've seen this already. But I don't think it's primarily his personality that makes him successful here. Rather, I think that his success as a leader has to do with his capacity to function well in the face of the dysfunction and the disorientation and the sabotage that is happening all around him. It's his ability to function well in that place of dysfunction that makes him the leader that he is. Edwin Friedman, he has written the best leadership book that I have ever read. It's this. It's called A Failure of Nerve. He follows the thinking of a man named Murray Bowen, who came up with a theory called family systems theory that thinks about the system of relationships, whether that's in a family or a community or a society at large. It looks at the way that people operate in relationship. And he talks about this idea of differentiation, is what he calls it. Differentiation is about self-definition, being my own self, and it's about self-regulation, regulating my own self in the midst of a community. It's self-definition and self-regulation of my automatic responses, because we all have automatic responses to what is happening with other people. This is a person's ability to remain distinct as their own person and unreactive to the emotional atmosphere around them. At the same time, remaining connected with the people who are emotional and fully aware of what's happening in the system. This is this idea of differentiation that he articulates. And Edwin Friedman uses a metaphor to describe this. The metaphor, he says, the leader's self-definition, who they are as a person and how they hold themselves as a person, is equivalent to the immune response in a living organism. The leader's self-definition is he says, the immune response of a living organism. He goes on to describe this, and he talks about a virus. A virus is a cell, he says, that cannot be self-sufficient. A virus cannot exist on its own. It's got no nucleus and no membrane, and so it's unable to differentiate like normal healthy cells. And most critically, he says, viruses are completely reliant on their host, the host cell that they invade, in order to survive. A virus has to survive by attaching itself to something else. So when a virus enters a person, for example, they seek to take over and run the show. And for Friedman, he says this represents a common challenge for leaders in relationship systems. The test of any system is when it's confronted with something that's toxic to its survival. It's the ability of the leader to regulate themselves in that place, regulate their reactivity when faced with heightened anxiety that results from others' behavior. And to the extent that a person can be self-defined and self-regulated, they can create health in the system around them to ward off any virus-like behavior that would infect. Does that make sense? Let me try to continue to explain it with a couple of quotes. He says this: "There is a way of understanding the self that leads to integrity and well-differentiated community rather than narcissism, isolation, and lack of feeling. It's to be found in the latest understanding of the immune system, which turns out to be far less connected with self-defense than with integrity." And when he's talking about integrity, he's talking about wholeness, something remaining a whole. So it's less to do with self-defense and more to do with remaining whole. Were it not for the rise of the immune response, he says, in organisms in general, most matter on this planet would be one huge fused mass. In other words, the very possibility of the existential category of self, that is, the category of me existing as a self, me being different to you, being differentiated, being distinct, the very category may have been made possible only with the rise of the immune response, which is the capacity to recognize and distinguish what is foreign. So what he's saying the immune response does is it recognizes what is outside and dangerous to my system, and it makes itself distinct from that. Doesn't allow that thing to shape who I am becoming. He says it's always been known that when organisms of a species that lack immune systems touch, they fuse as one. That is why the immune system is considered to have a more fundamental role than protection, namely it provides an organism with an integrity. about creating wholeness, for it to exist as a whole healthily. So he's saying that the leader functions as the immune system for the organization that they lead. If you're in any position of leadership, whether it's in a family or in a workplace, then this is relevant to you, functioning as an immune system. He describes this idea of differentiation. After this, I know I'm giving you some heavy theory here. I'm going to try to show you how this plays out in David's life and then bring it back. He says, differentiation is the lifelong process of striving to keep one's being in balance through the reciprocal external and internal processes of self-definition and self-regulation. Differentiation means the capacity to become oneself, integrous, out of oneself, with minimum reactivity to the position or reactivity of others. So, if you didn't make sense of a lot of that, that's fine. I'm happy to talk to you about it more because I realise it's pretty thick theory. But what I want to do is show you how David does this in these chapters. And I'm going to go step through the story and pay particular attention here to David's self-definition, how he defines who he is and his stance and what he lives for, and his self-regulation, how he does or doesn't react to other people's behaviour that he may see as inappropriate or unhelpful or anxiety-inducing. He has differentiation as a leader, and they play out in this story. So, here's the story. Abner has installed Ishbosheth as king. And Joab is the leader of David's army. David is king. And they line up for battle with one another. And they have this situation where they all line up on either side of the valley, similar to the David and Goliath story, where they're both standing there ready to fight each other. And instead of everyone going into battle, where it would be a complete bloodbath, instead they send 12 representatives from each of the armies to battle. And in this fight, what happens is that each of the 12 fight, and it's a bloodbath. All 24 of these men who fight are killed. All 12 kill each other. You might go, well, that's fairly unlikely, isn't it? What are the chances of all 12 killing the other 12? Yeah, fairly unlikely. And what I think this is it's a picture of what is about to come in the next chapters. Picture of the 12 tribes of Israel against the 12 tribes of Israel. It's civil war. And there are no winners. And it is a complete bloodbath. So prepare yourself. Full-blown civil war breaks out. And we're told that Joab's two younger brothers are part of his little troop. Their names are Abishai and Asahel. They're the sons of Zeruiah. Zeruiah is most likely David's sister. And so these guys are David's nephews. And they're kind of some of his best warriors. And so we're told that Asahel is chasing after Abner. And in the thick of the battle, Abner is calling back to Asahel and saying, "Stop chasing me. Turn aside and chase somebody else. Don't fight me. I don't want to have to kill you. Because if you keep chasing me, I'm going to get tired and I'm going to turn around and kill you." Asahel doesn't stop. And Joab says, "Please stop. I need you to stop because Abner, I don't want to face your brother Joab and tell him what I've done." But Asahel doesn't give up, and he continues to run and chase him until Abner kills him. Spear back through his guts and out his back, we're told. Pretty brutal stuff. So Joab and Abishai continue to pursue Abner to kill him. They pursue him all day until they're finally exhausted, and Abner calls back to Joab on the battlefield, and he says this really interesting thing. He says, Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know the end will be bitter? How long will it be before you tell your people to turn from the pursuit of their brothers? Which is a really interesting thing for Abner to be saying to Joab, seeing how Abner has been pursuing David for the past 10 to 15 years. And they're in battle here, and he's turning back to Joab and saying, stop pursuing, we're brothers, you shouldn't be pursuing us. Stop fighting against us. And Joab relents. He says, as God lives, if you had not spoken, surely the men would not have given up the pursuit of their brothers until the morning. So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the men stopped and pursued Israel no more, nor did they fight anymore. Well, that day, because the fighting continues, and we're given a figure here that says that David's men lost 20, while Saul's men, from Ishbosheth's men, lost 360. David has clearly won the battle. But the battle doesn't stop. There was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, and David grew stronger and stronger while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. And the writer here gives us a list of David's wives and his firstborn sons that are born to those wives. He's beginning to look like a king with his harem. He's got this line of descendants that are set up for him to rule after him. Meanwhile, Abner is making himself strong in the house of Saul, we're told. One day, though, Ishbosheth comes to Abner and he accuses Abner of taking Saul's, his father's, concubine, Rizpah, as his wife. He accuses Abner of this. And Abner reacts to this accusation. He's not self-regulated. He's a very strong reaction. He says this, am I a dog's head of Judah? Am I on Judah's side? Do you think that I'm working for them? To this day, I keep showing steadfast love to the house of Saul your father, to his brothers and to his friends, and have not given you into the hand of David. And yet you charge me today with a fault concerning a woman. God, do so to Abner and more also, if I do not accomplish for David what the Lord had sworn to him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah, from Dan to Beersheba. And Ishbosheth could not answer Abner another word because he feared him. So Abner's being accused of taking his master's concubine, which is, if he is doing that, it's a signal to say, I'm taking the kingship. Ishbosheth is just a puppet king. And it turns out that Ishbosheth does seem to be a puppet king because he's scared of his army commander. He can't stand up to him. I don't know how you read that comment about finding fault concerning a woman. I don't necessarily think it has to be a derogatory comment on women. It very well could be because of the way that women were treated. But the point that he's making is he's saying, I have been completely loyal to Saul. I've been loyal to Saul my whole life, my whole career. I've then installed you, his son, as king. But you're insecure and weak. You can't find fault with me in terms of my loyalty to Saul in battle, and so you make up something you suspect. And so you think you're standing up to me. But you're not really standing up to me, are you? You can't follow through on your accusation. And Abner, with this accusation, decides that he's changing sides. And he's going to go and be on David's side. David's a far stronger ruler. He'll stand up for what he believes. He stands for his principles. He knows who he is, and he commands his people. And if Abner effectively then brings Ishbosheth across as well. And Abner comes to David, and he tells David, done with the fighting between the two houses, I'm coming under your leadership. I'll bring them all across as well. And David, at this point, you'd think he'd go, oh, wonderful, I'm the king. Not quite. David says, I'll accept your offer on one condition. And the condition is that David's first wife, Michal, who was taken from him by Saul and married off to another man, that Michal be brought back to David. What David is doing here is ensuring that there's no other family faction of Saul that might oppose his kingship. He's very politically savvy, and what we see here is he's also very ruthless in getting what he wants, what he thinks is right. Because as Michal is brought back to David, we're told that her current husband, Paltiel, follows behind her weeping as she is brought to David. She doesn't reach David before Paltiel is stood up before Abner, and Abner says to him, "Go back." He returns, and we don't hear anything about him again. Separated from his love, he returns compliant to Abner's request. Well, Abner has moved across. Michal is back in under David's leadership. The whole of the house of Saul, it seems, is moving across under him, so he will be the king. Joab, meanwhile, David's army commander, has been out fighting the Philistines, and he wasn't around for this whole thing where Abner came and talked to David. And he comes back and hears that Abner has said that he's now on David's side. He's made a peace agreement with David. And he comes to David and he says, "How can you believe him? He's just trying to use you. He's trying to take your kingdom. He'll betray you. He betrayed my brother." David's aware that Joab holds this vendetta against Abner for killing his brother in battle, and David stays out of their fight. David lets them have their own feud. But Joab takes matters into his own hands. He sends messengers to Abner, calling him to come back to where David is. Presumably, he wants to have some more conversation. Abner pulls him aside and stabs him in the stomach, as he had done to his brother. The key difference here between those two deaths is that Abner and Asahel was killed in the height of battle. Here, Joab kills Abner, cold-blooded murder. He deceives him and kills him. David has endured the resistance of his opposition for years and years. Think of David in this position. And now, just as he's about to become king, just as the people are coming across to his camp and recognize his kingship, his own general is sabotaging his chances of finally uniting the kingdom under his reign. And so David's response is to curse Joab. He curses him and his family for what they've done, and he orders all of Judah, including Joab, to go into mourning for this murdered Captain Abner, this opposition murdered Captain Abner. They fast and mourn and sing a lament over Abner. David, technically, should have killed Joab. This would have been the thinking in the day, that Joab has murdered an innocent person. Joab's life is demanded because of that. But David doesn't kill him. Instead, he says, all of Judah and Israel will go into mourning for this killed captain. And the result of that is that David wins everyone's love and approval. So all the people of Israel understood that day that it had not been the king's will to put to death Abner, the son of Ner. And the king said to his servants, "Do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? And I was gentle today, though anointed king." I was gentle today, though anointed king. The king is supposed to be the one who is strong and fierce. This is what Abner had an issue with. Ishbosheth was, he's spineless. David is meant to be fierce and to just wipe out Joab because of what he has done, and David doesn't do that. He says, no, I've been gentle today. I've put myself in a place of weakness. Even if I'm king. He says, these men, the sons of Zeruiah, those three men, they're more severe than I am. The Lord repay the evildoer according to his wickedness. The Lord do it. David's saying, I'm not going to repay him. I'm not going to kill him as he deserves. I leave it to God. But this isn't the end, because there's one more step in painting this picture of David's rise to power. Ishbosheth, when he hears of Abner's death, he is completely terrified, as you'd understand. He'll completely lose his heart. He thinks Abner's gone across to David's side and he's been murdered, he's been killed. What chance do I have? And so he expects to be wiped out by his opposition. But it's two of his own raiding captains who will turn against him, thinking that they'll be better off in David's camp too. But before the action happens here, we're introduced to one more person in Saul's household who may have the right to the throne. His name is Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, who when Jonathan had died, he was 5 years old, and we're told he was picked up by his carer, and the carer dropped him as they were rushing away, and he was crippled in his feet. So Mephibosheth is the only one left in Saul's household that would, in this picture, have a right to the throne, and he is a crippled young man who, in their picture, has no ability to lead as a result. And so Ishbosheth's two raiding captors, Baanah and Rechab, go to Ishbosheth at night and they murder him in his own bed. And they carry his head through the night to bring to David as a display of allegiance to David. And what does David do to those who kill God's anointed? We know that already. He kills them. And so David kills these two men who have killed the person that God has installed as king of Israel. It's quite a scene, isn't it? That picture. It is a bloodbath. Civil war. It doesn't work. It doesn't achieve anything apart from dysfunction. As Abner had anticipated, it ends in a bloodbath where David is in a place of power as king of Judah, and Israel is completely decimated. What do we take from this? Here's what I think I would like just to point out. There are many other places in David's leadership where we see him, who he is as a leader and how he operates. But what I want you to see here is the way that David has functioned as an immune system for this organization that he's leading. As David stands as king, he has functioned as the one who has remained steady and able to hold himself together, defined in the person that he is, unreactive to other people's responses, making his own decisions. He becomes the immune system for this organization that he leads. You might think, well, does being the immune system mean getting rid of the people that the leader doesn't like? I'd say absolutely not. And I don't think that's what David does here. I don't think David is actually someone we want to learn our morals from. And so I think we need to separate that and say this isn't about his moral leadership. This is about the way he holds himself as a leader. His morals are very well aligned with the culture that he lives in. And I don't think we should be surprised by the way that the culture operates at the time. But what I think we can learn from is the way that David holds himself, who he is as a leader in this place. And what I want to do is to offer you 5 of Friedman's principles of leadership. He says these are the 5 major principles of leadership that we can see in David here, and I think shows him successful as the king. So here are the 5 principles. 1, the first principle is the capacity to separate oneself from the surrounding emotional processes. It is absolute chaos that David is leading in the midst of. It's continual battle. It is people turning against each other. And what we see, I think, is David being able to contain himself as himself, separate from the emotional melee out there, separate from all the anxiety and revenge and all the things that are happening. David keeps himself as his own person. It's his ability to know what's going on, but not become emotionally entangled in other people's business. It's the first thing that David does. Secondly, the capacity to obtain clarity about one's principles and vision. We've seen from David from the start, he very clearly knows what he wants. He is a person that is hungry for power. He clearly knows that he wants to be king. He believes that God has called him to be king. And the scripture text says, yes, that's right. David has been chosen to be the king. And David has this vision to pursue the kingship. But what he does is he also knows his principles. He knows what he will and will not do in order to step into that position. And he's waited for God's timing for him to be here. And even when he's here, he's not rushing it. He's very strategic, but he's not going to go against what his principles are. We'd see one clear principle we might disagree with, that you kill the person that kills the Lord's anointed. We go, well, we wouldn't operate like that, but that's actually very generous in his time, not to kill all the others as well. David acts on his principles and based on his vision. Thirdly, is the willingness to be exposed and to be vulnerable. I think maybe David is in some ways limited in this, but we do see that he is willing to be exposed and vulnerable. As the story goes on, he will be exposed very publicly. And even here, he is willing to say, I'm the one being weak here. I'm the one being gentle, even though I'm king. That's a position of vulnerability for a king in those days. And he is making himself vulnerable. His expression to God is one of very much of vulnerability. And that is one of his great strengths, that he's willing to make himself very vulnerable before God. His expression of grief and lament is key in that. Fourthly, his persistence in the face of inertial resistance. He has continual resistance that has bombarded him for the past 15 years. He's had ongoing persistence in the face of Saul trying to kill him. And he persists. He does not give up. He continues day after day. And finally, self-regulation in the face of reactive sabotage. When somebody reacts and tries to sabotage who he is and what he is doing and what God has called him to, he is able to regulate himself and not get overwhelmed and caught up. He regulates himself in his response to Joab in reaction to the murder of Abner. He has an incredible ability, I think, to regulate that, and I think it's actually been grown through those times of opposition and great difficulty for him. That he's learned to regulate his emotion, and he goes and talks to God about it. He expresses to God his angst so that he's able to lead his people with strength. Friedman says this about these 5 attributes. What makes these attributes universal is that they are not necessarily connected to personality traits or to cultural factors or anything that can be labelled gender specific. They are rather qualities that have to do with the capacity to function well when the world about you is disoriented and stuck in certain ways of thinking. That's the key line. This is what this leadership has to do with. Being able to function well in a world that's disoriented and stuck in a certain way of thinking. Nothing could be more universal. They apply equally to marriage, family life, and work. And so Friedman would say, if you are in any system that is dysfunctional and you practice these 5 principles, then in time, the system will become more functional. He also says it won't happen immediately because initially there will be reaction to you becoming yourself, to standing as yourself, as not getting swept up in the emotion of what's happening around you. And there will always be reaction to that. But if you can stand with these 5 principles and practice these, then you can grow to become a differentiated self, someone who is self-defined and self-regulated. And these are the key strengths of leadership. I think it's brilliant the more I think about what Friedman points out here and reflect on it, and it takes time to soak in. So if you're in a position of leadership, whether in your marriage or in your family or your work, how do you respond to these 5? Maybe you think, who would want to be a leader if that's what it takes? And I say, amen. But these are the kind of leaders that the world needs. These are the people that God is calling us to become. Or you might think, well, this is all well and good as leadership theory, but what would Jesus say about these things? How do we fit together what David's kingdom looks like with what Jesus' kingdom looks like? How do these two go together? We'd probably have to spend more time unpacking that, but I think I see 2 real and critical differences between David and Jesus' leadership. The first is the structure of the leadership. The leadership structure that David sets up, has here, is very hierarchical. It's top down. Jesus' leadership structure is flat. This is what the church is about. That's the first thing. What it means to be the king and to hold power is very different for David and Jesus. The second very, very key difference is the character of the leader. I spoke about this a few weeks ago when I talk about temperance, but David is failing in his character development, if that's what he's aiming at. Jesus would say the character of the leader is central to what it means for the leader to be a good leader. David's claim to power is centered around himself and it benefits himself first. Jesus' claim to power is also centered around himself, if you think of it, but it's done for the benefit of others. Jesus' leadership demonstrated that he understood the power of a person's character is far more potent than the power of position. So I'd say that there's very real differences there, the structure of the leadership and the character of the leader. But I'd also want to point out that who embodies the ability to carry out these principles that we've looked at more fully than Jesus himself? Jesus is the one that lives like this, with those 5 principles. The capacity to obtain clarity about one's principles and vision. Jesus is super clear about what the kingdom of God is and what it means to live in that kingdom and how to step into that kingdom. He's crystal clear on that type of character that inhabits that kingdom. Jesus' capacity to separate himself from the surrounding emotional process. When you read the gospel, watch the way that Jesus does that. It's remarkable. His ability to be faced with death threats, aggressive hatred, and remain calm and respond reasonably. He's remarkable. Jesus' willingness to be exposed and to make himself vulnerable. Who has been more exposed and vulnerable as a leader than Jesus? And yet stood up as the man that he's been called to stand up as. Not fight back, not push back, not try to explain himself, simply to let the accusations fly at him. Remarkable. Jesus' persistence in the face of inertial resistance. That he was here to establish God's kingdom on earth, and the religious people, the people that should have understood what he was about, they're the ones that just come at him. And Jesus is able to stand firm and calm and gentle in the face of that and continue in his walk toward Jerusalem, knowing very well what was ahead of him. And his self-regulation in the face of reactive sabotage. Jesus' very death was a sabotage by the religious leaders of the time, taking him down so that they could get their own way, because he was claiming to be king. And they thought that they were sabotaging his kingdom, but actually he was showing us what it looks like to be king. He was showing us what it looks like to be a leader, to offer yourself to the point of death. Jesus is the person for us to learn from. Leading with these attributes may be what it takes to reorient any marriage, any family, any organisation, any society, any civilization, or in the case of Jesus, to reorient the whole world to a new way of living and leading. Right. Jesus, thank you for your example, for giving of yourself, for showing us what leadership is and what it looks like. We thank you for the stories of David and this mess that the world is and was in, and the way that you've been about establishing a kingdom in that mess and through that mess, and through flawed people like David. And you're still in that business through flawed people like us. And so we invite you to shape us, to draw our attention and our sights to you, to look to you, so that we might live the way that you desire.